there's already been talk, in the Trump administration from other people that we need to make some kind of camps for these homeless people that are in the way. And that is also a red flag. What they're doing is they're picking groups that they think that they can marshal people behind. But as we already know, once you have a camps bureaucracy, you tend to get more camps. The trajectory we're on right now, if we don't help make sure that court orders are followed, if we don't make sure that we keep the right to protest in public, those are the two things. Independent courts and public protest are the safest ways to keep this from expanding. And I think that there's still a long haul for Trump from Trump being able to do this to anybody at any time. But I think that is what he would like to do. And I think that we need to act in the window in which it's still easy to act to keep that from happening.
About that. So let me introduce you properly here, and then we'll get into some of our weird connections as well as your book. Okay. This is Frank Schaeffer, and I am the host of In Conversation with Frank Schaeffer. I'm also an author, and my guest today is Andrea Pitzer, and she is the author of a book that is really too timely in a horrible way. It's called One Long Night, A Global History of Concentration Camps. I sort of ran into Andrea recently because she had written an article, which I believe was in The Atlantic, on Amway, which was a company started by the folks that actually funded the anti-abortion movies that my father and I made in the 1970s. And so, of course, I read the article, asked Andrea if she wanted to talk about it, and she said, no, not until that book's out, but we can still talk about some other books that Andrea has written. And one of them is what we're talking about today. I just want to tell a personal thing, and then it's your program, and we're going to talk to you about your book. You wrote The Secret History of Vladimir Nabokov, which recast the life and work of the Russian-American novelist through geopolitics of his time. I haven't read that, but I'm going to, because my wife, Jeannie, and I used to see him quite often, not in person, as in sit down for tea, but since he lived in the Montreux Palace Hotel, and that's where we walked all our kids on the sidewalk down there. And my first paying job as a teenager was helping with the light show in the Strobe Club. In front of the Montreux Palace, they had a pavilion, which at that time was disused, and they allowed the Strobe Club to start there. Now it's all been refashioned into some fancy tea room or something. But Nabokov used to come in sometimes and have a drink in the evenings. And so you've written a book on Nabokov. We used to see him around on the quai down in Montreux, where he was living in a suite for 17 years in the Palace Hotel. The last book, Jeannie, she read your memoir of his, your biography of him when it came out. And the last book she read on Nabokov was a book about his wife.
Vera, yes, Stacey Schiff's
and
book.
So it's so funny because you're writing about stuff we, Jeannie and me, sort of know about and are already very interested in. So that's a very odd introduction to something, that we need to talk about in terms of concentration camps. But go figure, my head sort of exploded.
Well, it's funny you say that, because in researching that book, I actually went to Montreux, and I know the tea room setup that you're talking about that took over that lawn and was at the Palace Hotel. And so we're separated in time, but geographically even there's that overlap as well, that I went through Montreux doing the research for that book.
Yeah, and I'll just drop one more name just to show you what a weird life I've had. The last time I was in the Montreux Palace was with my mother before she died. She died many years ago now. She was 90 years old, and we were sitting in the Montreux Palace, and she ordered a glass of champagne. And as a teetotaling fundamentalist Christian that I grew up with, in terms of her own arc of a journey, who was sitting there was B.B. King in the same room. B.B. King walked over to my mother and talked to her. And at 90 years old, 2 nights later, she was in the Montreux Jazz Festival with B.B. King, having been given a backstage pass by B.B. King, sitting in his dressing room. So
that's wonderful.
Yes, it sounds like a bit much, but I'm telling you the truth. This is all true.
But the Jazz Festival was a huge thing there. And the Palace Hotel is sort of the fanciest large thing. It's not a big place, right? So it all logically makes sense, but it ends up in this wonderful moment that you have with your mom. That's great.
Yeah. And so as a teenager, when Claude Nobbs, who started the Montreux Jazz Festival back, I forget when it was, 68 or 69, it used to just be in the casino before the old casino burnt down. So one time, and then I'm going to shut up and we're just going to do your book. But one time I was, as a teenager, I had a moped, and it would take in a car you could get from our house to Montreux in about 25 minutes. On my moped, it took over an hour and a half because the top speed was 25 kilometers an hour. And I would dress up and try to be very cool and go down and do all this thing. So one night I got the fulfillment of my dreams because Claude Nobbs, somebody who was working with him when I was working at the Strobe Club, invited me to one of his parties. And by that time, he lived down on the quay and was very fancy, as part of that Montreux scene. So I went to his villa at age 15. I think it was like 2 in the morning, and this was my moment to be cool. And of course, to be cool as the son of a fundamentalist missionary living in Switzerland, I never announced who I was. I would barely say my name. I get into this and I'm talking to Claude Nobbs. Finally, I meet him, and there's all these fancy people. And I'm a horny young 15-year-old, and every woman there looks like a model. So it's like I've sort of died and gone to heaven and hell at the same time because I'm very much an outsider, and I'm hoping that the mud splatters on my jeans from the moped drive aren't too apparent. So finally, Claude's introduced to me and asked who I am. And it was very polite. And I said, my name's Frank. And he said, Frank what? And I said, Frank Schaeffer. And then remember, I'm the missionary kid trying to be cool, and I'm never going to talk about my parents' ministry. And he said to me, where do you live? And I said, oh, up near Villars. And he says to me, you mean in Le Brie, in Weymouth-sur-Olon, where Francis Schaeffer, is he any relative of yours? And my heart, of course, completely sinks because my father's this well known. And he said, oh, yeah, well, I used to go to Bible studies with your father at Mark Halberter's house, who is my dentist in Montreux. And then it was like all my cover exploded. And now I was just Francis Schaeffer's, a pastor's kid thing. Claude Nobbs of all people. It's like, go figure. And he wasn't in any way a follower of my dad at that point in my life. But anyway, it ruined the evening. So that's it.
But it wasn't ruined by who you thought would ruin it. It was
No.
ruined by, yeah, that's pretty funny.
Yes, and
I'm
I've been,
sorry, it wasn't
now,
fun
and
at the
here I am,
time, but
72 years old, telling the same story and still thinking and writing about my exit from that world. So let me dive into your book here, and I know I've gotten it's your fault because you keep writing about things that have some sort of weird connection to my life. I put together a series of quotes from your book, One Long Night, A Global History of Concentration Camps. And the first thing I want to say is it's way too ripped from the headlines for my liking. This book churned my stomach for many reasons. You're a beautiful writer. It's fantastically gripping. It's a horrible subject. It's universal. Concentration camps are a relatively new phenomena with all the wicked things that have happened in history coming out of the sort of the 18th and 19th century through the Boer War. And you trace all of it right up through Guantanamo Bay. It's a massive book. Couldn't be more important than right now in the Trump era. And I just want to put together a series of quotes I want to read from different pages. Concentration camps are at the heart of a modern phenomena and belong in the company of the atomic bomb as one of the few advanced innovations in violence. As Hannah Arendt once said of violence as a means to an end, the end sometimes shifts or is never attained. The use of concentration camps changes the world, but going forward, the most predictable outcome of their use is a world with more camps. If these mechanisms of detention are left in place worldwide, an attorney will always appear with a legal rationale for the impulse to detain and torture at will. And you talk about Guantanamo Bay in another context and all our CIA activities, et cetera. Back to your book. Where abuse is set as policy, someone to play the butcher can always be found. Half a world away sit burned out villages of the Rohingya, the camps of North Korea, the black sites for systems yet to be discovered. The last moment in time when no concentration camp existed was more than a century ago. That moment seems unlikely to come again. The face of the planet is riddled with camps and the ruins of camps. Even from the vantage of outer space, it is still impossible to take it all in. There is always a location out of view on the far side of the globe where the innocent and the guilty and those in between have been trapped together for a time. For now or forever, old camps reopen, new ones are born, no final chapter can be written yet for the chronic spectacle of the camps. And you have written a magnificent book, and I think I put it together from all different pages in your book. This is not one passage, but I put it together as the kind of thing I would have done as your editor if I was looking for the back of your book to give this is what this book is. And the first thing I want to say, literally with tears in my eyes, is that, um, as a writer, speaking to a writer, your bravery in diving into this shocking subject has shocked me because, I've visited a few concentration camps, but I could not have done what you've done. And I want to thank you as a reader for your individual personal bravery as a writer to delve so deeply into soul destroying suffering and to tell us the truth about this history and also to show our own American involvement in this cruelty. And of course, you published this book quite a bit before Donald Trump's second term. I think it came out in 2017 or something. So you were a year into his first term. And of course, what's happened in the last 2 months since his election is just like a new afterword to the book. And far from this being over or history, you've written something that's so contemporary that it literally churns my stomach. Okay, that's a long, crazy introduction, but I just want to open the floor to you and tell us about the book.
So, like you, this subject still kind of turns my stomach. And after I wrote this book, it did come out in 2017. It was really hard to write. And I thought, well, what is just as important as this that will take me someplace where there are no concentration camps? And so my next book was a 400-year-old Arctic survival story that
Yeah,
also casts light on climate change and colonialism and some other things. But literally, I needed to move away from this book
yeah,
after I finished it. And I do want to say to people who might be considering reading it, and you don't have to buy it. You can get it at your library. Most libraries do have it. So this is not just trying to shill the book, but I would encourage you to read it because it's much easier to read it than it was to write it. And
yes,
there's a
yes,
lot of information in there. And I specifically picked a lot of stories of people who survived because otherwise I think it would almost be too hard to read the book. And so the book is deliberately structured so that you will survive it. You may need to put it down a few times, but I think it is understandable. It is human. You won't emerge totally in despair, but you will have a pretty clear idea of this sort of cycle that we've got ourselves into that we have not broken. I think a lot of people probably imagine after the death camps of Auschwitz and it took some years for the toll of that to really be understood.
yeah,
But once it was understood, I think people imagined this problem went away. But
yeah,
all that really happened was, thank goodness the death camps were shut down. That was a critical step for humanity to take. And at the same time, the staggering toll of the death camps made it so that everything that had come before sort of didn't count anymore. And they weren't
yeah,
seen
yeah.
as concentration camps, even though it was decades of camps all
Mm,
over the globe that had existed. People forgot about that earlier history. And that's one of the reasons I think that we find ourselves returning to it
yeah,
because there is this amnesia that we have about this. And in every country, literally every country, every time that these camps start to arise, somebody says, hey, aren't these like those other camps?
yeah,
And each governing party or president or administration in each country always says, no, no, those were bad camps, but this is different. And these people are truly the ones we want to put in camps are truly a danger. And this is truly our only option. And so the
yeah,
same argument gets used. And as long as we have that amnesia, I think that it's going to continue to be used. And literally nobody had written this history before I put it down. There were people who'd spent 40 years just studying Ravensbrück or,
yeah,
the Soviet Gulag. So it wasn't as
yeah,
if nobody had studied camps, but it was when I was writing the Nabokov book, and Nabokov's younger brother Sergei died in a German concentration camp. And I
yeah,
visited that camp researching the Nabokov book.
yeah,
And I was looking around for where is the book that talks about where these came from? Because, of course, Nabokov was very concerned about them rising in Russia as well.
yeah,
And nobody had written a history of how concentration camps came into the world. There literally was no book like that. And
yeah,
so I thought, oh, I have to write this book. And so I was supremely unqualified to do it. And I wouldn't call it bravery, as you termed it, but I would say kind of relentless drive to make sure
Yeah.
that this story would be told. And I pitched the book and sold the book and started the book before Donald Trump was elected. And so when
Yeah.
it came
Yeah.
out in his administration and I began speaking out against border detention, policies of separating families and all this
Yeah.
in that first administration, a number of people attacked me and said, you just hate Donald Trump.
Right.
And I was able to point, and I was happy when they did it like on social media because I could link right after their statements, like post after post after post of criticisms and prior articles I had done of Obama, of
Yeah.
Bush, of Clinton. This is a long-term policy that all of American history, since
Is
the rise
part
of
of.
the camps is part of. And
Yeah, and
that's part of what
had
we
they
have to
actually
reckon
read the
with.
book,
Yeah.
they would known that because, of course, the history you go into in terms of the British and in Kenya and colonialism and the Boer War and so forth and so on, you don't pick favorites and you don't pick battles with right or left because, whether it's Cambodian Pol Pot or, the Gulag, you're very hard on the left. And when you think about how the international left in the United States and Britain sort of soft pedaled their visions of Soviet Union back in the 30s and 40s and covered up for the famines and so forth, which the left did, by the way, as you well know. No one who reads your book can come away with any conclusion except two things. First, Andrea Pitzer has written the history of concentration camps, not just death camps. Secondly, Andrea Pitzer doesn't approve of concentration camps, whether from the right, left, or the middle, whether it's the French in Algeria or anybody else. I just want to read something else from the book. I have no wish to excuse, this is from later in the book, excuse the leaders and followers who perpetrated war crimes or peacetime atrocities. Rather, I mean to suggest that it is worth paying attention to the historical moments in which camps appear. So I want to jump from that back to you and ask you to give me a thumbnail of the historical progression of camps and take as long as you want. Either that or I have to keep reading from your book, and I'd rather you're here. So let's hear it from you.
Well, so one thing I want to say, I think we kind of have to pop back to the 19th century and the evolution of camps for people to sort of understand what they rose out of, because a lot of
Yeah.
people will say, well, what about Civil War detention? There were some horrific camps that were for that. What about slavery? What
Yeah.
about exile under the czars in Russia? I mean, there are a lot of precursors. Indian relocation,
Yeah.
huge precursor, and those things are all really important. But you have this moment where all these kinds of detention are percolating, and the technology is part of what makes the transformation. And you have the development of automatic weapons
Yeah.
and their mass production.
Yeah.
You have
We
the
have the Maxim guns and they don't, whoever it was you quoted.
Exactly, yes. And there's a famous poem. And then also there's the development and patenting and mass production of barbed wire,
Yeah.
which
Which you have a big
makes it,
section
because
on.
before, if you were going to detain a lot of people,
Mhm.
you needed a lot of people to detain a lot of other people.
Right.
But once you can hem them in with places they can't get out of easily, and once you can kill a lot of them with only a few people,
Yeah.
then it changes the trajectory of how you need to use force to detain other people.
Yeah.
So it's sort of a product of technology. It becomes possible to do this, and that's when you see the shift from things like Native American reservations, where people were moved far distances
Yeah.
off to undesirable land, but that impulse as you had with reservations is similar. It's this idea of taking an unwanted group of people out of society
Yeah.
and isolating them, erasing them, and of course then at its final trajectory does become the final solution, which
Yeah.
is not just isolating them from society, but literally removing them from existence.
Yeah.
And so, from the first moments in which those camps were created, the very first guy who had the idea to impose them in a formal modern way was in the 1890s in Cuba. And he said, as a member of a civilized nation, I won't do this. He was the one who said, this is what we would have to do to put down this rebellion. And it was the Spaniards putting down a rebellion in Cuba. But he said, I won't do it.
Yeah.
And that was where that part of the quote that you read that mentioned the butcher, a general who was already nicknamed the butcher, was
Correct.
brought in to do it instead. And the same model happens again and again. Sometimes it's during warfare. Once it was used widely in colonialism, then perhaps not surprisingly, and Hannah Arendt has written quite a bit about this, but those tools of colonialism were brought right back into the heart of empire. So during World War I, you have not just locking up civilians of a rebel community, but you're actually locking up people you're at war with in World War I in Europe. If they are, even if they've been living in England, let's say, for 30 years, but they were born in Germany, you're
Yeah.
locking them up as enemy aliens.
Well,
And
and
then
you
the
talk
next
about the internship in the States of the Japanese population, and I think you mentioned, I forget the number, but it's something like that the government was aware of maybe 200 to 300 people who had been posed to the US who were actual Japanese agents, but then they had since been neutralized or discovered. And then, of course, thousands of people are locked up. So the sort of relationship of the paranoia and the suspicion of this one group of the population that had to be locked up bared no resemblance to the actual level of threat. And that's sort of a theme that goes all through the book in all different iterations.
Yeah, it's politically expedient. It becomes useful to those in power to lock that group up. And the
Yeah,
threat is almost always not misunderstood, but misrepresented
yeah,
deliberately at some point. And so, for example, you're talking about World War II detention with Japanese Americans. Again, more than 100,000 were detained,
yeah,
most of them American citizens.
yeah,
So, not even enemy aliens, most of them at that point. But the advantage was, well, first of all, the reason it happened, there had been opposition to it. And actually, the Navy intelligence had written an extensive report saying it would actually be more likely to create agents and turn people against the US if
sure.
this internment were done for the very reasons you talked about, because they'd already neutralized the threat. But there was some advantage, and there's still arguments about who were the prime movers on this, but to getting that Japanese farmland, to having your political star rise further for neutralizing this threat you
Sure.
had imagined and created. So, for all the usual reasons, it's different actors each time, but the motivations are always the
It is
same.
the
It's a
same.
way to hold power. It's a way to seize power or hold power by attacking a vulnerable group, isolating them, and then pretending that they're the worst things that ever lived. And as you talked about, we're doing this in Guantanamo right now.
Yeah, one thing I want to mention to my listeners, again, this is Frank Schaeffer, and we're talking to Andrea Pitzer about her book on concentration camps. Um, we are going to make that our book club offering in May, and I know it came out, what is it, 2017? It's quote a while.
2017.
This
Yeah.
is not a new book, but it's weirdly timely. In fact, it's awful because it's ripped from the headlines in the sense that we are, your book goes into some detail about what the CIA did in terms of interrogation techniques and putting people in secret prisons and so forth and so on. And by the way, my son, who was in the Marine Corps at the time, served at the beginning of the Afghan war, was in Bagram as someone in signals intelligence and fought in that country and did two tours and one in Iraq. So we got very involved with American foreign policy on a kind of a frontline position of being parents of someone in combat. Fortunately, he came back safely, went to the University of Chicago, is married, has three kids that I do childcare for. But what was interesting was that his own connection with that war kind of changed his view on certain things because as part of signals intelligence, he was working with people who were doing the kinds of things you're talking about. And when he came back from the war, the part that he found most damaging personally was watching what we were doing in terms of rendition and so forth of people that he was, on quote, our side. So there was a kind of a visceral connection to that. And I want to now go through some of your chapter heads and take you a minute to give me a thumbnail on each. So the chapter one, I'm going to read them all and then ask you to go back. Born of the Generals, chapter two, Death and Genocide in South Africa. Chapter three, the First World War and the War on Civilians. Chapter four, Gulag Rising. Chapter five, the Architecture of Auschwitz. Chapter six, Increments of Evil. Chapter seven, Stepchild of the Gulag. Chapter eight, Echoes of Empire. Chapter nine, Bastard Children of the Camps. Chapter 10, Guantanamo Bay and the world afterward. And of course, we're in the world afterward. And Guantanamo, ironically, as we speak, is being resurrected now as perhaps a camp for another group of unwanted people who are being arrested as sort of aliens within our culture, et cetera, et cetera. So can we just sort of go through the chapter headings and literally give me a very quick thumbnail of give me some notes on what's in each chapter, and then we can dive in a little more deeply.
Sure, but since I don't have it memorized, cue me with each one, and then I'll give you the thumbnail.
Okay, I will happily do that. And you're like me. I only remember the book I'm working on. I never go back again. So Sailing to Guantanamo, tell me about that.
So that is the sort of forward to the book. And in
Yes.
that, I open with going myself to Guantanamo
Yeah,
to sort of see where does this indefinite detention without trial, because those guys still, the 9/11
sure.
5 in particular, haven't been trialed. How does that fit in? Does that fit in to this history of camps that I know I'm writing?
And how does it fit in now when we're going to see people arriving there supposedly who are illegal immigrants to our country, some of whom the Trump administration says are criminals, but now we have articles saying a lot of people are being rounded up, some of whom may even be citizens. So we seem to be reviving Guantanamo. Just give me a footnote on how that strikes you having been there.
I would say that it was so surreal to be there, that this place existed, that it was continuing to exist. It's a Navy base, so it has all that weird everydayness of the Navy base.
Sure.
And yet that the torture that had happened there, that the
Yeah.
government was still fighting acknowledgement of it. Incredible. If you read the book, incredibly surreal things happen in my time at Guantanamo related to CIA torture, related to other things. And so it was surreal then, and it is surreal now. A week before we knew anybody, or a few days before we knew anybody had definitely been taken there, I did an interview with Slate. And in that, I said that, the person said, well, they're saying it's the worst of the worst. So
Yeah.
Kristi Noem from Homeland Security and Tom Homan, the borders are, we're just going to send the worst of the worst there. I'm like, those are literally the words that Donald Rumsfeld used in
Exactly.
2002. And there is no more reason, because that turned out not to be true. And
Yeah.
there's no more reason to think it's true now. And as you said, we've already seen that at least a third of the people there do not have any criminal record. Many of them seem to have actually scheduled appointments to try to apply for asylum. This is
Yeah.
not the criminal class that we were promised. And even so, I would say this is an illegal way to do that. But it
Yeah.
is
And you talk,
clearly, they're
and you talk in the
misrepresenting it.
book about, a couple of these people back in the last sweep being waterboarded to the edge of their life, somebody being waterboarded more than 80 times as an experiment being run by the interrogators to see what worked, and later turned out to be someone who had nothing to do with anything.
Yes, and one person 183 times, the one who had nothing to do with anything. They have still decided that even how he was tortured and what was done to him should still be classified, so he should never be allowed to leave
Yeah.
because of what they did to him. Can you see this surreal loop of how this like rationalizes
Yeah.
itself when there is no rationalization for
Yeah.
it?
What's
So,
interesting as someone literary, just speaking to you because I know of the scope of your own writing, it's so interesting that the fulfillment of kind of this terminology of Kafkaesque loop, is something that the CIA was doing with yours and my tax dollars. Okay, chapter 2, death and genocide in Southern Africa.
well, actually, the Born of Generals is the first chapter after the
Yeah,
fourth.
sorry, born of generals. You're
Yeah,
telling me
and
that,
so that
yeah,
is about the development of the first camps in 4 different places around the
right.
globe. You mentioned the Boer War. We mentioned Spain trying to put down rebels in Cuba. There's
Yeah.
also the U.S. in the Philippines,
Hmm.
and we have Germans in Southwest Africa right next to the Boer War.
Yeah,
And in
Namibia,
each
where,
case, there's this
yeah,
military operation to try to put down independence uprising. And the answer to it is, in the generals' minds, is to move all the civilians out of the contested territory and hold them somewhere, and then just kill everybody who's left, because there's your resistance fighters. This
yeah,
is an incredibly bloody strategy that leads to so much more harm among the civilians that you're relocating than it even does, when there's tremendous
yeah,
casualties in battle, that in
yeah,
fact the civilian casualties are much worse. So that's sort of the origins of camps.
yeah.
And
And you
then
talk,
the
go ahead,
second
sorry.
chapter is the Boer War and the
Death and
sort of,
genocide in Southern Africa.
yeah, it's the Boer War and the Germans in Namibia. So that's where I dive deep into that, and that is looking at. This is the first time where it's not just sort of a spur of the moment strategy, where
Mhm.
it is a planned thing that is done in a structured way, and in theory, in the Boer War by the British, humanely. They imagine it's humanely, but they're
Yeah,
not being careful citing these camps. They're not being careful making sure they get supplies. And they're clearly trying to punish their military opponent a little bit. And so what you end up with is tens of thousands of mostly women and children dying. They're also almost forgotten in the general population, at least,
yeah,
Black African camps, which were so much worse than even the white camps that we saw these terrible tolls in. And next door in Namibia, it's much worse because the Germans begin with a genocide. They are planning to just
Yeah.
kill all the people that are resisting rule in this particularly rebellious area. The Nama and the Herero people are the ones that they're attacking.
Yeah.
And they rescind the Reichstag, the legislature in Germany rescinds this genocide order. They refuse to fund the war. And yet those people then are moved into camps. So this is the first time you see sort of this conjunction of
Yeah.
deliberate genocide with camps, but it isn't nearly as streamlined as it's going to be later under the Nazis, of course. But you see the whisperings of the beginnings of this.
Yeah. You
And
see the
so
beginning of it and the
and so
brutality
that's the
in
sort of
Namibia.
colonial, yeah, that's
Yeah.
the colonial era stuff. And the brutality and the death tolls are just horrific from all of these first two chapter camps. But then we
Yeah.
come into the First World War, and that's the third chapter. And in that, there's this rehabilitation of the idea of camps.
Mhm.
So World War I begins, and the English decide to lock up German civilians that happen to be in England at that time. Germany also does it. But of course, we're in the middle of this colonial era. So when these European countries are doing it, all their possessions around the globe now are doing it
Sure.
too. Other people are swept into the war, they're doing it. And so you end up with a time where camps were largely discredited in that decade before because of this horrific toll. Suddenly, within a period of a year or so, you have camps circling the globe, dozens of
Yeah.
countries. And this is where the bureaucracy of camps starts. The Red
Yeah.
Cross starts checking them out. You can send money to people in camps. Sometimes there's lending libraries. Each country is competing to look more humane than
Well,
the
then you
other
have a
one.
story. One camp, the guy says, "Well, we'll give you kosher food." And then one of the people that you talk about in the book and you tell his story, he signs up, says, "Okay, I'll move to the Jewish section of this camp." And then he later thinks, well, maybe that was a mistake because things unfold differently. So I just want to tell potential readers that not only is the book very readable and beautifully written, but the stories of individuals punctuate these large stories. So you may be listening to Andrea thinking, well, it's kind of a book of history, but actually it's a book of wonderfully told stories about individuals caught up in these moments. And then, of course, that sheds a light on the bigger story. I just want to say that because, of course, I'm making you do this pass through the chapters, but actually the character of the book is, this wonderful piece of writing that tells the stories of the people caught in this. So chapter 4 is the Gulag Rising. Maybe go there and tell us about.
Okay. And so I will say one thing, though. I'm glad you mentioned that because, yes, I'm doing the panoramic thing here, but it was really important to me to have at least one start to finish story in each chapter of somebody who is swept into the camp system and then what happens to them. And in some cases where the camps go on a really long time, as with the Gulag, or where the toll is so horrific and varied, as with the Nazi camp system, you will get 3 or 4 complete stories of people who had very different
Yeah, and by the way,
experiences.
and the sad part of doing an interview like this is, of course, it never transmits the flavor of the book because the stories are what take you through the book, but you don't do this horrible journalistic thing where you start with a little story and pull the writer in, and in a news story you do that and you skip to the third paragraph to figure out what the writer's actually going to do. Your stories are like novellas in themselves, and you finish each one feeling so close to the people caught. So, you've done the thing that great historians do, and that is you've really brought each of these moments alive and
Well,
with tremendous sympathy.
well, and that was my goal. And it was interesting because I don't get credit for this observation at all, but I was glad somebody made it. I was at dinner with some professors after a talk that they had brought me to their school to give, and one of them said, I noticed that you have almost no theory in the book at all, because there's a lot of theory about detention and
Sure.
punishing, and they said I noticed there's none almost at all. And I started to explain that I had put some in the foreword, that I had like
Yeah.
addressed that this exists, and then somebody else interrupted and said, why would she do that when she has the actual lives to tell people about, in terms of if you're not studying theory. I mean, theory is super useful, I think, to understand it on an academic level, but I did not want to lose sight of this. These were actual people that this happened to, right? And it's this sweep of history, but who gets swept in were these individuals. It was these individual lives that were affected in profound ways. And it's that kind of targeting that is what camps are about. It's
Yeah.
not, I wanted to render them with faces again, and not this group, not just Jewish, not just a
Yeah.
rebel,
Yeah.
not just even sometimes a criminal, right? But as a
Yeah.
human being.
Speaking of which, chapter 5, the architecture of Auschwitz.
So we go right from Russia into Germany. And by the time Hitler came to power in 33, the Russian Gulag was already well established and full
Yeah.
swing, involving so many people. But I try to think of it as sort of branches off the trunk of a tree. It
Hmm.
wasn't that the Gulag influenced the Nazi camps directly, although once in a while you would have some little crossover. But for the most part, they all grew out of this common root, that World War I detention that was global. So, of course,
Yeah.
the Nazi camps take on this very German flavor. And there had been labor camps in parts of Germany before. There had been some things. And so this idea of internment, which Hitler really wanted to make Jews alien. And he had an
Yeah.
idea of putting them in concentration camps right on the heels of World War I, before he was ever in power.
Yeah.
And it wasn't death camps that they were thinking of. They hadn't
Right.
imagined that yet. But it was this idea from World War I. And I think there had already been this hierarchy and established, accepted approach, which is you have to register. You have to turn yourself into the authorities when they ask. You're assigned a
Well,
number.
you tell one of your stories goes there with someone who sort of dutifully turns themselves in, but this was in, I believe, in France. Perhaps they were in the Velodrome or one of those places, and they were told to register and turn themselves in. Uh, and you tell the story of sort of looking back that people just sort of took this as so normal that okay, we've got to fill the paperwork and turn ourselves in.
Well, and because that's what had worked in World War One, and the World War One camps were not death camps, right? And so people thought, oh,
Right.
this is just like a bad time for my people, whoever it is that's being detained in that moment. In this case,
Right.
Jews, and but also political opponents, a variety of communities that are targeted in Germany. And then the plot switches, and there's not a release, and there's not any of the things that happened in World War I, but left open, those camps get worse and worse and worse. And it takes almost a decade for them to come up with the final solution. But
Yeah.
it's a decade of those unsupervised camps. And just circling back for 1 second to Gitmo, that was part of my concern with Gitmo, is the camps left open and
Yes.
left unmonitored will devolve. And
Well,
so
and
in
ironically, left open to keep some people in prison so they won't tell the story of what was done to them once they turned out to be,
So it's all
waterboarded.
of those things.
Yeah.
Exactly. It becomes a self-reinforcing loop,
And
but
now it's
also
still
that
there.
stuff from chapter 3 with the World War I detention, the actual just bureaucracy of the camp. The Red
Yeah.
Cross goes to Gitmo today. The Red Cross went to some of the Nazi camps, right?
Right.
So even having this institution, I think, makes people feel like if there's a bureaucracy, it can't quite be that bad, right? But in
Yeah.
fact, this is something that's learned to, camps as an entity kind of have learned to absorb bureaucracy and make it more and more lethal.
Well, the Red
So
Cross was even inspecting places like Theresienstadt and gift care packages could come through, and they would and they would clean the place up for inspections, and they were bureaucratized totally, and even fit in with world international things very much as the United Nations makes comments on various things. Somehow almost normalizes them. Oh yeah, this is something we investigate. And were they nicer camps or worse camps? Are these death camp yet? Or are they just slave labor? We've normalized this process.
I think that we have to fundamentally revisit our idea of like how people can be detained and when they can be detained. And
Yeah.
so the Nazi chapter is the biggest chapter in the book, as it should be. And just to make clear for anybody that's listening, one of the dangers of doing this kind of book is that you relativize the Holocaust.
Right.
And I will say with utter sincerity that there is nothing else like the death camps that have happened on that scale, with that kind of intention, with that diversion of material
Yeah.
during a war, and let us not ever repeat it. Yet there have been many things before and since that were horrific in nature.
And you talk about somebody making that point, saying
right?
each of these things needs its own word, and we're going to reserve the word Holocaust for the actual Holocaust, and it can't just be applied loosely to anything that it has similarities.
Right. And so this is we have to hold two things in our head at the same time, which is hard for all of us as humans. I think we want to decide things. And these other things can be abhorrent and can lead, if we are not
Yeah, they
careful,
can.
to things like the Holocaust. And so it's imperative on us as humans to not do that normalization that you're talking about, to not do that. And so after Auschwitz, the next chapter, I think, is Increments of Evil. And
Yeah.
that one is I look at what was happening around the world in while the Nazis were doing this horrific death camp system. There was once again this alien detention during war. all around the world. And the U.S. did it, as we talked about with Japanese American detention. The French did it. The British did it.
Sure.
But you saw it in many other countries as well. And I think it helps to remind us that it wasn't just, oh, Nazis are bad guys, they do camps. We're good guys, we don't do camps. We were doing camps, but having the mechanisms to have them undone more quickly or to not go as
Yeah.
far, that is the only way that I found that democracy is actually better than Soviet Russia or Nazi Germany,
Yeah.
is literally, can you change the people who are in power? Can
Yeah.
you have courts that have some independence? So the courts screwed up Japanese American detention, but the courts then also changed it in another case that came before them, and
Sure.
Japanese American detention, even before the end of the war, started to be undone. So
Yeah.
democracy is not a better system to keep it from ever happening, but it's
Yeah.
a better system in terms of stopping it from getting worse. But there is no system that is invulnerable to it. So I wanted to address
Yeah.
that was going on around the world. And then the next chapter you have is
Stepchildren of the Gulag.
so the stepchildren of the Gulag is sort of what happened after World War II, when the world broke into when the Iron Curtain came down, and you had people kind of growing up in this bipolar world of Soviet and Western, vying for power.
Yeah.
And the Soviets ran proxy, sort of, not that they were directly running the camps, but the model of the Gulag was adopted in Eastern
Yeah.
Europe, where they had so much sway. It was also adopted by China. It was briefly adopted in Cuba. We
Well,
saw
and you
it in
talk about how
Vietnam.
China each learns from the other. What worked for the French suddenly starts working for the Russians, et cetera, or what worked for the Germans works, in World War I is adapted to the death camp program in World
And
War
in this
II.
case, the Chinese actively admired the Soviet model
Yeah,
after once we got the rise of the PRC and they won that civil war, then you see them actively instilling and installing a sort of Chinese flavored version of the Gulag, which again has all these local influences and local traditions that are part of it. But you end up with the ability to sentence people without trial for extremely
sure.
long periods. You have the kind of and there was the idea of re-education through labor in the Soviet system.
Yeah,
In the Chinese system, it was literally not just re-educating you, but teaching you how to think. So it was this idea of correcting thought,
yeah,
and was even more intrusive in some ways. And of course, that system went even longer than the long-lived Gulag system. And so I wanted
yeah.
to look at places, and you mentioned also Cambodia. And so I wanted to cover all those places that sort of came even loosely under that communist, even if only in name, but
Sure.
revolutionary Soviet influenced camps. And so that was a huge thing. And then I think the next chapter
Well, and
is,
echoes of empire,
which is then what's happening in that same period in the West, right? So
yeah,
again, we might imagine, oh, these are the bad camps, the communist camps. But then I wanted to look at what was happening outside Eastern Europe, outside
yeah,
China, outside the Soviet Union. And it was some of the camps you were mentioning before, which is there were all these independence movements in former colonies at the end of World War II.
yeah. You talk
And so you
about
have the British in
Kenya, and
Kenya, you
yeah,
have the French in Algeria,
yeah,
and then that also involves to the French in the US and Vietnam. This happens again and again and again in an assortment of countries.
yeah,
And what we see there is a real return to that Born of Generals first chapter I wrote, where
yeah,
you've got people trying to put down rebellion, so they start trying to clear the countryside. And if you've ever heard the line, "We have to destroy the village to save the village,"
yeah,
that's essentially a camp philosophy. We're going to move all these people out and put them somewhere safe from these rebels, when in reality, the people who are running the military operation want those people where they have control of them, right?
yeah.
And
They
so
want
it
to just get
becomes a
rid of that whole
control and
population.
detention.
So
And
let's,
so, so that's
yeah.
where it goes.
And then you get bastard children of the camps, and then the last one is Guantanamo Bay and the world afterward, which we've sort of been talking about. But so maybe just talk about those last two chapters.
So the bastard children of the camps, in South America, you had a lot of countries that had been democracies for a long time and had gained independence already.
Yeah,
And the US very much had the sort of Monroe Doctrine still during the Cold War, where they
sure,
didn't want anything happening in the Americas that they didn't have a strong hand in. And when some of those countries, Cuba, Chile, start having revolutions, or start actually, in the case of Chile, electing far left
sure,
politicians, the U.S. does not want to tolerate it. So
yeah,
it happens across the 60s, but you see it with real intensity with Henry Kissinger and Nixon
sure,
in 73 with Cuba. I'm sorry, in 73 with Chile. And you have the CIA helping to train military figures,
Yeah.
and in also to fund certain attempts at assassinations and coups. And so, really, by meddling there, we create this secondary version that is a really bizarre version, which is this network of countries that it's called Operation Condor, is what it was
Yeah.
named. And it's
Yeah.
a network in which there's shared detention, there's torture, but you see all these weird capitalist things that we see in Gitmo now arise, which are this kind of just-in-time detention where they only had big camps for a brief period. And then after that, they would hold small numbers of people, then dump bodies out by helicopters, as I'm
Yeah.
sure people have heard about, or they'd be disposed of in other ways. And then you bring in the next set. And so there's this outsourcing of detention, sometimes to other countries.
Sure.
You have this
And
torture that's
it's a big range of, the piranhas and Chile and so forth and so on. You get into that, but I want to fast forward to something toward the end of the book and just read it because it kind of brings us a little up to the present. Camps in Russia, China, and North Korea alike were part of systems that lasted for decades or more. North Korean camps are still fully operational. The Gulag is long gone in Russia. Yet show trials and sentences for political enemies of the state persist, like recurrent low-grade virus, a detention in hard labor camps continuing the present day. China sits somewhere between the two, etc. So you do talk about the fact that this is happening, and the reason I bring it up now is in the context of the fact that we have an American president who seems to be disregarding this reality when it comes to Russia, is kind of recrafting his personal history of Ukraine, which, of course, in your book, you talk about a little bit because they figure into some of these horror stories in terms of what was done to Ukraine. And so I just want to make sure we don't get too close to running out of time here before I talk to you, Andrea Pitzer, as an observer of history, who has sort of seen your book made horribly relevant in a weird way because of fast forwarding from the first Trump presidency into the second, which seems to have an entirely different agenda, including the rehabilitation of the very people who are still using systems which other people at least are pretending are part of our darker bits of history. But now we've grown past that. Maybe we're hiding a few people in Guantanamo still who we don't want to hear their stories, but we're not doing that anymore, quote unquote, or pretending not to. And then two things are happening, and then I would like your opinion. It seems to me that Donald Trump is resurrecting the type of politics which will make taking people who don't fit in with his program and marginalizing them to the point of putting them in camps a possibility again, beginning with, for instance, quote unquote, illegal aliens, who these wide sweeps for people we just don't like, who wind up in places like Guantanamo Bay or other places. And then also this kind of totalitarian impulse that it's least manifested in rehabilitating people, not just reaching out to Putin or others, but in actually rewriting history to turn people who were very much seen by Americans as the bad guys until recently into the good guys because we want to do deals with them. And it kind of reminds me of a bit of history, which is kind of surprising and disconcerting, where we had thousands of people who had been SS officers in the camps on various lists. And the State Department basically told the Europeans to throw out all the court cases in the denazification program. A handful were put on trial in Nuremberg, and the rest within 3 years of the end of the war. By 47, everybody was just headed back to normal jobs across Europe and in Germany particularly, by people in our State Department who were actual anti-Semites, who had been there the whole time and never had wanted to make a point out of the story of the Holocaust. I don't know if we're in a parallel moment of history, but it seems that with Trump right now, we have people in power and fellow travelers with the tech bros and others who would not be shocked by the idea of reopening camps or doing similar things in a way that would have seemed shocking, say, 10 years ago. And you talk a little bit how Obama, never really had the courage, I guess, to go there completely in terms of the truth on these things. But I don't know if I'm alone in thinking we're in a very different place right now as you and I speak this afternoon. We're at another place. I don't know what that chapter will be. And I want to pick your brains on this and ask what you think.
well, and just to be clear, again, I have criticized every president, in that book, I think I probably criticized every president for the last 100 years. But what Obama was doing is quite different than what Trump would like to do. So the people who say there's no difference between Biden and Trump, or there's no difference between Bush and Gore, like that's simply not true. When it comes to detention policy, you can make very clear distinctions on what was done under each. And I would say, for instance, that Obama, given what I know about these camps, if he had had that information, you know, probably should have used more political capital. He wanted to close Guantanamo, but Congress blocked him. Should he have fought more to do that? Should he have fought for accountability for the people who did torture, that they would be, made to stand trial for that? I do think that. I understand there was a different policy, and his policy was not so we can do more torture later. It was, I think it's better to try to put this behind us. But what I know is you don't actually put it behind you unless there's accountability. And so we see that because in the book, you'll see that I think Trump's name is only mentioned maybe in a footnote. Like I
Yeah.
tried not to have him take over the book, even as I was finishing it, just as he had been elected. But he and this is important, other Republican candidates for president in 2015 and 2016, ahead of the election, were saying things like, I'll send more people to Gitmo. We'll do waterboarding and a hell of a lot worse. It
Yeah.
became a campaign point. So we're in a worse place with his second administration than we were with the first administration. But even if you go back, you can see the seeds even then where people are vying to show this performative cruelty that isn't just performative, right? They are actually willing to do this, and they are starting to. And part of what I hope people get out of the book is it started with dangerous foreigners being the sort of patsy, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
And it started also in more than one place with homeless people being, we have to get these people off the streets.
Sure.
And you see that happen in a couple different countries. And there's already been talk, in the Trump administration from other people that we need to make some kind of camps for these homeless people that are in the way. And that is also a red flag. What they're doing is they're picking groups that they think that they can marshal people behind. But as we already know, once you have a camps bureaucracy, you tend to get more camps. And
Yeah.
I think we're starting from a position where the people in charge already very much would love to have that power. And just as you noted, the allies that Trump is picking and the allies that he's destroying relationships with, the ones he's building, the ones
Yeah.
he's destroying, are very much tilted toward the indefinite detention without trial and abuse of civilians.
Yeah.
And I don't think we should ignore that at all. The fact is, we could absolutely change that. We still have tools and mechanisms in place. There are protests happening every day. But I think that we need to be paying attention and making moves, making congressmen accountable at the local level that we can
Yeah.
drill in, raising public awareness, because the trajectory we're on right now, if we don't help make sure that court orders are followed, if we don't
Yeah.
make sure that we keep the right to protest in public, those are the two things. Independent courts and public protest are the safest ways to keep this from expanding. And I think that there's still a long haul for Trump from Trump being able to do this to anybody at any time. But
Yeah.
I think that is what he would like to do.
Yeah.
And I think that we need to act in the window in which it's still easy to act to keep that from happening.
Yeah. Yeah. And I couldn't agree more. And of course, as I said, your book, One Long Night, on the history of concentration camps is nothing to do with Trump, in the sense that your writing and research on the book predates his run for the presidency by quite a bit. So it's certainly not part of our political moment, as in, oh, here's another book that's anti-Trump, because it's not. Here's a book that actually tells of a history that has engulfed every part of the world and every regime, from far left communist regimes all the way up to and including the way certain camps were run during the Civil War in terms of prisoner of war camps. And they all have one thing in common, that is the dehumanization of one group of people in the name of, well, these aren't our kind of people, so they're put off to the side. Just as a kind of a detour here, I told you a little bit of a couple personal stories at the beginning, and I want to relate one to you that you'll find interesting given the research you've done, and then we'll circle back to the book again. I made an anti-abortion film series called Whatever Happened to the Human Race in the late 1970s, featuring Dr. Sierra Koop, who was Surgeon General for Ronald Reagan afterwards, and my father, Francis Schaeffer. And really, most historians who've studied it credit that series, Whatever Happened to Human Race, and book, and our national tour of 23 cities, which was funded by the folks at Amway, And, people that I ran into and knew personally. Richard DeVos came to my home right here in Massachusetts once and sat in my living room and gave me a book, et cetera, et cetera. And they put hundreds of thousands of dollars into that project. And they were very much of the pre-Trump right, but that there's a direct trajectory from the work we were doing with those movies, turning abortion into a litmus test to Trump's election and the evangelical right. Okay, that's the context. In the filming of that series, Dr. Koop and I were at Mauthausen in Austria, which is a concentration camp that wasn't a liquidation camp so much for Jews. It was more for political prisoners and Russians and others who had fallen afoul of the Nazis. And we were staying for budgetary reasons in a nearby university dorm situation when that school was on holiday. I forget what the holiday was. And it was this big, eerie building. We each had a room, and then there was a common area. It was quite a large complex, and it was a couple miles from Mauthausen itself, the concentration camp of Mauthausen. And we'd filmed a whole sequence there in aid of saying that if you legalize abortion, the Nazi program then had used euthanasia and so forth, and we're going to wind up where this camp was ethically. Well, that night, my crew was there, and it happened we had just been filming in Israel the week before, and I had an all-Israeli crew of about 16. So every single person on the crew was Jewish, besides myself and Dr. Koop, and a couple local Austrian production managers, and they put us in this place to sleep. So we were there that night, and we wanted an early night, and then we were down in a common area where we were going to be fed, and we went down there, and way far away in this huge dining room that probably seated 500 people at another table at the other end with lights on only there, and where we were was a group of older people talking, laughing, drinking, and singing. So I finally went over and I asked them who they were. So picture me, I've got an all-Israeli crew filming in Mauthausen, making a project that is going to start the trajectory of Trump's election, looking back in hindsight, by turning an anti-feminist manifesto, which is what our program was, into a movie. The guy singing down there was an annual meeting of the local Waffen-SS people who had worked in the camp as guards. And this is in 1970. So they're older, but they're not old men yet. And they are singing their old songs together. And my whole Israeli crew is there. And our Austrian production managers, finding out what they were doing, were begging some of our beefy grips and electricians from Israel not to go over and challenge them and get in a fight, because nobody could figure out how this would end. So our crew all left and went up to the dorm rooms early, having half finished their supper. And literally, my crew were the children, some of whom, of Holocaust survivors, who were literally shaking. And I was thinking, I had not thought about that story till I read your book, but I just thought, wow, I'm 72 years old, and I was part of a right-wing movement which has legitimized places like Guantanamo Bay, in the sense that I helped put George Bush in office, if you want to put it that way, because of our stupidity of making this anti-feminist thing. I have long since repented and changed my mind. But when I read your book, I was just thinking of, what are the odds of all the gin joints of having an all-Israeli crew sitting in Mauthausen trying to have their supper, while the ex-SS guards who had run the camp were over at their table reminiscing and having a jolly old time together in the mid 1970s.
And I think that it's the perfect anecdote for us to come to the end with here, because the answer is those things never go away, right?
Yeah.
And if they are never going to go away, you have to address them right as quickly as you can, so that they don't sort of build power and retain that ability to still be shaping society, to still be intimidating people. You guys were intimidated for one evening, but one wonders in the town, what other things happened there, and what kind, how are their children voting now, and how were they raised, and so it's a thing that's both extremely personal, like that story, in that room where it's just the two groups of you, and yet it is literally the whole country and the whole world. And what we have seen, and I think that the Trump moment really brings clear, is whether you're Xi Jinping, leader of a communist country, whether you're a post-Soviet oligarchy as Russia is today, whether you're Trump trying to dismantle American democracy, there is a common fever in the world that is always sort of there under the surface. And if we don't address it, if we don't build the institutions that will protect us from it, then it's never going away. We have to make ourselves safe from it some other way.
Yeah, and your book is so apropos of this moment. Again, I want to thank you for writing it, and just say that we'll make it our book club offering in May. I hope everybody reads the book. If you're a student of history or you are a teacher, read the book and take Andrea's words to heart, because she knows what she's talking about. Please come back and talk about your new book on Amway at some point, because again, this sort of odd connection, and come back and talk about anything you want. Do me a favor, Andrea, stick around for a moment after I sign off. I'll go away, but stay around and talk to my producer, Ernie, for a couple minutes, because we would like to ask you if you would like to give us some names of people you think we ought to be talking to, who also bring a perspective on the things you're talking about at the end of this interview, which are the right to protest, gather, stand up, demand the courts not only take action, but also that that the Trump administration follows whatever the judges may do to curtail some of this, or we will be on this same trajectory again. And that is not alarmist, because we're already on it. Guantanamo Bay is being resurrected now as a center for another group of people we want to otherize and say are no longer welcome here. So please stick around. And then before I finish, let me ask you if there's, I had so many more quotes to go through, but we did what we did here. Is there anything else you would like to say that perhaps we missed getting into? I tried to give some idea of the scope of the book. What parting thought do you have, or do you just want to leave it there? How
Well,
would you?
the one parting thought I would give is when I was writing this book, my brother said, "Isn't it dispiriting to see all the times in history that this has happened again? Is this just the fate of humanity?"
Yeah,
And it's definitely can be dispiriting to try to think about this in the big picture. But at the same time, I said, no, you've got the wrong end of the stick, because what I found was people have to be coached to this. They have to be propagandized to this. And it takes years to do it. And if it takes years to get people to where they will accept this kind of thing, then there are points where we can intervene. There are ways to protect our societies. There are
yeah,
things that we can do. And so I think it's really important that this is not inevitable. This is not just human nature. This
yeah.
is power holders finding ways to manipulate populations. And if that's what it is, it's mechanisms, and we can fight that. So what I don't want is for anybody to leave this conversation today or read the book and think, so there's nothing we can do. The actual point is there's a lot, but we have a hard slog for sure.
Yeah, because your book, what you're saying right now, and also the book makes clear, is that it does not come naturally to someone to be party to locking up a whole group of people to die of, illness or starvation, or being ignored or intimidated or killed, or in the extreme case of a death camp, murdered there on the spot. And you're saying it takes a long time to desensitize people. And I see a relationship between our desensitizing towards the way women are treated, the fact that Trump put his thumb on the scales and had Andrew Tate flown back to the US with his brother. And you know perfectly well that he'll never go back for trial on rape and charges and so forth. And I just see a kind of a continuity here. At the end of the interview, I don't want to broaden it up to something we can't go to, but when it comes to the point you're making, which is a sort of a general program of desensitization of the way we treat women, the way we treat minorities, the way we treat each other, this is very much part of the Trump program. And there's no question about it. And I don't think it's an accident that so many of the people he surrounded himself with, like Hayesgeth and others, have some sort of a history or record or verify, many, many accusations of treating women in certain ways. This is a tough crew of people, and they seem to have already included a lot of people at very high levels that are very desensitized when it just comes to interpersonal relationships.
I would say they're cowards. I mean, they're tough people in the way that they're willing to do brutality, but I think that uh, they seem to me to be tremendously insecure people,
Yeah,
and they'll be really vulnerable to tides of public opinion against them, to having their understanding of being able to sort of pick off one group at a time challenged. So I
yeah,
think the critical thing is that that especially people that they imagine are like them.
Yeah.
So, the white guys, the corporate guys, the more that those people will show up alongside these groups that have been doing a lot of work already to try to stop Trump and say, no, we don't go with you. Like, this is who we're casting our lot with. We're interested in the real world, not this weird, sick fantasy world that you guys seem to have developed. Because, yeah, that there is clearly an anti-woman, deeply misogynist threads, but
Yes.
also deeply
Yes.
racist. And again, there's the cliche about first they came for the this or that. I mean, that's not just a moral exhortation, right?
Right.
It is literally strategic planning. Like, we have got to, I don't care if, you're some 58-year-old guy who hates the word woke and like woke people doing things. And,
Yeah.
we have to get over whatever our nominal small differences to
Yeah.
say that it's clear that a majority of the population is against the most extreme things that this administration wants to do. And so we have to make a stand against those things. And the rest of differences we can figure out later, but we don't leave anybody behind, not trans people, not Latinos, not black people,
Yeah.
not women. Anybody they're trying to attack right now is just the wedge to be able to do it to more people. And it has to be opposed morally, yes, but strategically as well. We
Yeah.
literally need to come together as a society to refuse to go down this path that Trump now has the power to try to make us go down. But he
Yeah.
cannot actually do it without us accommodating that.
Yeah, and how do you see, and to wrap this up, the relationship between what I would regard, for instance, as the traditional Roman Catholics, whose teaching involves standing up against things like starting concentration camps and dehumanizing a segment of people, even if you regard them as sinners, to put it in that language, and the tech bro type people who don't seem to have that interest, and then people who sort of cross over the difference between them, like Peter Thiel and others. It just seems to me that there are people, who wrote Project 2025 and others who know perfectly well that the theology that they subscribe to, which, for instance, would regard adultery or homosexuality or being a trans person as a sin, nevertheless also has a very strong teaching. That meant, for instance, that in Italy, there were many devout Roman Catholics who were hiding Jews to the point where the racial project in Italy was transformed before 1944, when the Germans just took everything over. And in 45, before that, the Italians hadn't been very good at racism on a scale that is embraced by Germany, no matter what the race laws were, because a lot of local parish priests and Roman Catholics just simply wouldn't go there. And they would not denounce their Jews and round them up. So what in America now of this weird group of people, from the tech bros all the way through to Andrew Tate and the kickboxers, these manly men, who actually are sort of cowards and children. How do you foresee that as a historian and a writer and someone who has a very keen sense of these things? Isn't part of our hope that there are actual real Roman Catholics in Project 2025 who won't go down this path because they remember how Roman Catholics in Italy stood against the Fossili concentration camp. And when they were starting to imply the race laws, it was, there were individual stories of Roman Catholic heroism, of hiding Jews and standing against it because they really believed in the Christian doctrine when it came to that. Surely there are people who are being caught up in the MAGA movement who are actual practicing Christians, if I can put it that way, who at some point will rebel against the idea of the level of dehumanization, misogyny, and other things, just on the theological basis of believing what they say they believe about the teachings of Jesus.
Well, I think that there's a couple different levels, and certainly there are MAGA people that are simply deluded,
Yeah.
that have been mistreated. And there's also this idea of Project 2025, I think, is very different than MAGA. And so with MAGA, I think there's a lot of delusion. With Project 2025, I think it's manipulation. But even so, we may see people that will peel away, like the 21 people that resigned from Doge the other day, rather than carry
Right.
out this stripping of the administrative state. So I think we have to assume that most Project 2025 people are not salvageable, but if some come over, we need to welcome them.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of MAGA people, when it actually is their grandmother that's kicked out of the nursing home, when when their Social Security check doesn't come, when their kids with who has a disability at school is no longer accommodated, or their trans sister can't serve in the military anymore, you're going to see some of those MAGA people peel off. And I think it's critical not to shame them in that moment if they're willing to. We got to have a coalition against Trump. We can
Right.
account for it all later. You can have your family arguments, you can forgive each other, not forgive each other, but
Yeah.
we need to stop it. And so we need to be available to anybody that comes. But I think the key thing is to rally the people that already are against him, try to wake up a little bit, literally make woke some of the ones that have just checked out for years now,
Right.
and then be open to MAGA, and then open even to the more extreme people if they are willing to repudiate it. Because the more that walk away from it and the higher profile they are, the more it weakens Trump and his people. But I think
Yeah.
that, again, we need to be doing it, it now, because I think we will see some churches, and we already are seeing some, demanding sanctuary be still observed. In other
Yeah.
words, that aliens could be kept in their church. And we need to applaud that and support that and recruit those churches. We need churches on near military bases to have those pastors talking about lawful orders and illegal orders, and also immoral orders. And, there's a
Sure.
lot of ways I think the church can play a role, and I hope that it will.
Yeah. And we will leave it there. I just thank you so much for this book.
Well, thank you for
It
having me
meant
on.
so
It's
much to me
great.
reading it.
I
Yeah.
really appreciate getting a chance at this moment to sort of let people know about it again.
Yeah. Well, tell Ernie who else we ought to be talking for. And if you want to bring somebody back as a co-guest, we can split this screen 3 ways, no problem. But if you have someone we should be talking to and you'd like to appear with them, doesn't have to be a writer or an academic, but just people who have stories to tell, but also just as part of this resistance, help us do our little bit to build it.
I'll talk to Ernie. We'll figure it out.
Yeah, and listen, odd way to end, but much love to you. I love your book. I'm so looking forward to the one on Amway. And anytime you want to have anything to say, just tell Ernie I have something to say, and we'll book you because you're wonderful. And I love your books, and you have become a hero of mine. So
Well, I
thank
wouldn't
you.
go that far, Frank, but we'll definitely talk again. Thank you so much.
Hero's a good word. Hero's a good word. We need leaders, and you're one of them.
Well, thank
Okay.
you.
Talk
Take
to you
care.
later. Stick around. Talk to Ernie. Bye.